From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Zafer kazanan insan mütevazı olur, öyle mi?
Those who declare victory are modest people. You won this, so be modest.
Sonra
From now on, we work to ensure nobody will get upset from now on. We will work to overcome every shortcoming.
Turkish voters deal a major defeat to Turkish President Erdogan as his party loses local elections in Istanbul and Ankara. Now he's disputing the results. We'll speak with Turkish professor Koray Kalashkan. Then to Algeria, where after 2 decades in power, 82-year-old President Abdelaziz Bouteflika resigned Tuesday after weeks of mass protests.
I went out to celebrate the resignation of Bouteflika. We have removed the biggest pin. God willing, we will have a 100% democratic transition. This is very important.
Now Algerians are continuing their protests, demanding an overhaul of the entire political system. We'll get an update. Then to France, where Yellow Vest protesters took to the streets Saturday for the 20th straight week of anti-government demonstrations, in spite of a government clampdown.
Macron must give in. They must give in to our demands. Everyone needs to live better with a month's salary. So we are always here. We will always be here until he gives in.
The Yellow Vests are protesting Macron's pro-business economic policies, demanding fair wages for working and middle-class citizens and heavier taxation on the wealthy. We'll go to Paris. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Senate Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's invoked the so-called nuclear option, speeding up the confirmation of President Trump's judicial nominees. After just 33 minutes of debate, senators voted Wednesday along party lines in favor of the new rules, which will limit the Senate to just 2 hours to debate on whether to confirm nominees to U.S. district courts. The move rolls back a more than 2-century-old Senate tradition of unlimited debate for federal court nominees. Under McConnell's Senate leadership, President Trump's already succeeded in appointing federal judges at a record pace in a move toward far-right judges that will reshape the judiciary for decades to come. Members of a House committee have cleared the way for Congress to subpoena Special Counsel Robert Mueller's full report on Russian interference in the 2016 election. Wednesday's 24-17 vote by the House Judiciary Committee along party lines came one day after Attorney General William Barr missed a deadline imposed by lawmakers to turn over the full Mueller report. This is Committee Chair Gerald Nadler.
The Trump administration has an idea. They want to redact the Mueller report before they provide it to Congress. The Department of Justice says the proposal is a means to protect sensitive information that would not ordinarily be made part of the record. But we have reason to suspect this administration's motives. The Mueller report probably isn't the, quote, total exoneration, unquote, the president claims it to be.
This comes as the New York Times reports investigators on Special Counsel Robert Mueller's team believe Attorney General Barr failed to adequately portray the findings of their inquiry and that they were more troubling for President Trump than Barr indicated. The chair of the House Ways and Means Committee on Wednesday formally requested the IRS give Congress copies of President Trump's tax returns over the past 6 years. Trump's the only major party presidential nominee in over 40 years not to release tax information to the public. President Trump repeated his claim Wednesday he's withholding his tax returns from public view because he's being audited, but Trump's former personal attorney Michael Cohen recently refuted that claim in congressional testimony. This is Democrat Dan Kildee, a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, who said Congress is requesting Trump's tax documents from the IRS because, quote, the president is the only person who can sign bills into law, and the public deserves to know whether the president's personal financial interests affect his public decision-making. In Florida, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents have deported an undocumented Argentine immigrant rights activist who was arrested last month shortly before a film showcasing his activism premiered at the Miami Film Festival. Claudio Rojas was featured in the film The Infiltrators, which tells the story of undocumented activists who went undercover to expose abuses at a Broward County immigration detention center. Rojas has lived in the U.S. for 19 years as father and grandfather of U.S. citizens. His attorney called the deportation a travesty of justice, telling the Miami Herald, "It's clear this is retaliation." To see our interview from the Sundance Film Festival with the director of The Infiltrators and two of the activists who appear in the film, go to democracynow.org. In New Zealand, police say the man accused of opening fire with an assault rifle at two mosques in Christchurch March 15th will face 50 murder charges and 39 counts of attempted murder when he appears in court Friday. The 28-year-old Australian man is an avowed white supremacist who emailed a racist manifesto minutes before the attacks began. Meanwhile, Australia's Senate has formally censured a lawmaker who blamed the killings on immigration policies that allow Muslims to move to New Zealand. Far-right Senator Fraser Anning's comments came on the day of the Christchurch massacre. His Senate colleagues Wednesday denounced the remarks as shameful and appalling. This is Australia's first female Muslim senator, Mehreen Faruqi.
Sadly, what Senator Anning said after the Christchurch massacre, however shocking it isn't out of character. Just a week before I joined this place, he gave a speech calling for a ban on people like me coming to this country and for a white Australia policy. He even invoked the despicable final solution in his speech.
In Tennessee, the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office is investigating whether white supremacist graffiti found in the parking lot of the Highlander Center is linked to a fire last week that destroyed one of the Civil Rights Institute's buildings. On March 29th, the fire tore through the main office of the Highlander Research and Education Center, the famed social justice organization that once hosted Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and trained Rosa Parks in nonviolent civil disobedience. This is Highlander co-director Ashley Woodard Henderson.
We are physically okay. Everyone on our staff is physically okay. No one was physically harmed. We did lose, obviously, some really important historical documents. It was not our full archive.
Authorities are investigating the fire as a possible arson and hate crime after a white power symbol was found spray-painted in the center's parking lot. The symbol is frequently used by white power groups and was painted on one of the guns used by the alleged mosque shooter in Christchurch, New Zealand last month. In a statement, the Highlander Center said, quote, "While we do not know the names of the culprits, we know that the white power movement has been increasing and consolidating power across the South, across this nation, and globally," they said. In Texas, police have dropped a felony arrest warrant against an African-American woman who was threatened with a gun and brutally beaten by a white man in a Dallas parking lot March 21st. 24-year-old LaDae Lee says what should have been a minor traffic dispute quickly escalated to violence when 30-year-old Austin Sheffield followed her, brandished an unlicensed handgun, and slapped Lee's cell phone out of her hands as she tried to call 911. After Lee fought back, Sheffield repeatedly punched her in the head while allegedly shouting racial slurs. Lee was the first to be charged in the case on felony criminal mischief charges for allegedly smashing the windows of her assailant's truck after she was assaulted by him. But when a bystander's video of the incident went viral on social media, prompting street protests, prosecutors dropped charges against Lee Wednesday. Her attacker, Austin Sheffield, now faces multiple charges. Elsewhere in Texas, one person was killed and two others hospitalized after a blast tore through a chemical plant outside of Houston Tuesday. The fire at the plant in Crosby, which produces a highly flammable gas used in the production of jet fuel, was the second such fire at a Houston-area chemical plant in less than 3 weeks. On March 17th, a massive fire at a petrochemical plant in Deer Creek sent a cloud of toxic smoke over Houston and is so far away as Austin, 150 miles to the west. President Trump's under fire for falsely claiming that windmills cause cancer. Trump made the remark in a speech to the National Republican Congressional Committee Tuesday, where he touted U.S. oil and gas drilling while mocking renewable energy.
If you have a windmill anywhere near your house, congratulations. Your house just went down 75% in value. And they say the noise causes cancer. You told me that one, okay?
On Wednesday, Iowa Republican Senator Chuck Grassley called Trump's remark idiotic, adding, quote, "I wish his staff would tell him I'm the father and now the grandfather of wind energy tax credits." On Capitol Hill, Democratic lawmakers grilled Labor Secretary Alexander Acosta Wednesday over his role in securing a plea deal for billionaire serial sex abuser Jeffrey Epstein that allowed Epstein to avoid a federal trial and possible life in prison. In February, federal Judge Kenneth Mara ruled Acosta broke the law in 2008 while working as a federal prosecutor in Florida after he concealed the plea agreement in violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act. Acosta's move effectively ended an FBI probe into the case alleging Epstein sexually abused and trafficked more than 30 underage girls. Secretary Acosta was called before a House Appropriations Subcommittee hearing Wednesday where he was confronted by Congressmember Catherine Clark and other Democrats. Clark noted under federal sentencing guidelines, Epstein should have faced a minimum prison sentence of 360 years.
But that's not what happened, because there was a power dynamic here, wasn't there? We had teenage girls with no power, who were rape and sexual assault victims, and we have Mr. Epstein and his friends, extremely powerful, wealthy, and connected people. And in a ruling on February 21st of 2019, Judge Mara found you illegally entered a non-prosecution agreement that allowed Mr. Epstein to serve just 13 months in county jail.
Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday.
Jeffrey Epstein was known to socialize with many prominent figures, from Bill Clinton to Donald Trump. Former Vice President Joe Biden says he'll be more mindful of people's personal space after two women stepped forward to accuse the likely 2020 presidential candidate of inappropriate touching. Earlier this week, former congressional aide Amy Lapus said Biden approached her during a Democratic fundraiser in Connecticut in 2009, pulled her head toward his face, and rubbed noses with her. Her allegation came days after former Nevada Assembly member Lucy Flores said Biden came up behind her, smelled her hair, and planted a kiss on the back of her head at an event in 2014. This is Joe Biden speaking in a video posted to Twitter Wednesday.
Social norms have begun to change, they've shifted, and the boundaries of protecting personal space have been reset. And I get it. I get it. I hear what they're saying. I understand it. And I'll be much more mindful. That's my responsibility.
Many Democrats said Biden's statement fell short. Lucy Flores said in a statement, quote, "Given the work he has done on behalf of women, Vice President Biden should be aware of how important it is to take personal responsibility for inappropriate behavior, yet he hasn't apologized to the women he made uncomfortable," she said. New Mexico's governor signed a bill abolishing Columbus Day and replacing it with Indigenous Peoples Day on the second Monday in October. New Mexico joins Alaska, Minnesota, Vermont, Oregon, South Dakota, and Hawaii in honoring Indigenous people with a holiday. Meanwhile, more than 50 cities across the U.S. have also voted to stop honoring Columbus, an Italian explorer who massacred and enslaved Arawak Indigenous people and opened the door to the European colonization of the Americas. And in the Philippines, the nation's highest court has ordered the government to release documents about thousands of deaths linked to President Rodrigo Duterte's war on drugs. Human rights groups say the release will shed light on extrajudicial killings that opposition lawmakers say have left 20,000 dead since Duterte took office in 2016. This comes as award-winning journalist Maria Ressa pleaded not guilty Wednesday to charges of tax evasion following her second arrest in what she says are bogus politically motivated charges. Ressa is the founder of the independent news site Rappler and a vocal critic of President Duterte. She spoke to reporters just after her not guilty plea.
I still say that these cases are all politically motivated. I mean, where in the world do you come home on a Friday, get arrested, post bail, and on a Monday get another arrest warrant and post bail again? I've been arrested twice in a little over a month and a week or so, right? So it's clear, but we will fight every single one and hope for the integrity of the men and women who will handle these cases.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.
We begin in Turkey, where President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's AK Party suffered major setbacks in local elections this weekend after dominating the country's political system since 2003. The AK Party lost control in both of Turkey's largest cities, Istanbul and Ankara, and is now disputing the results. Voters expressed frustration with Erdogan's autocratic rule and are also facing soaring inflation and rising unemployment. This is Erdogan speaking after the election.
Every victory and every loss is the will of our nation, and we have to accept this fact as a necessity of democracy. We will admit that we won people's hearts in cities we won, but we were not successful enough in cities we lost, and we will act accordingly.
Erdogan's AK Party has filed appeals to contest the results from all of Istanbul's 39 districts, saying there were irregularities that need to be corrected and demanding a vote recount. There have also been allegations of voter suppression in Kurdish majority regions in the east of the country.
A party chairman called the election one of the most stained in our democratic history, he said. But other government officials have insisted the election was fair. A state-run news agency has said recounts are underway in 18 districts in Istanbul and 11 districts in Ankara. For more, we're joined by Koray Çalışkan. He is faculty fellow at Heilbronner Center for Capitalism Studies at the New School here in New York. He's previously joined us from Istanbul, where he was an associate professor of political science at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. Welcome to Democracy Now! And to New York City.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thank you.
Talk about the significance of what has taken place in Turkey. Is this a real earthquake, political earthquake for Erdogan?
It's a small earthquake in Richter scale, but it's the beginning of the fall of Erdogan's authoritarianism. It has a great potential for two reasons. Firstly, 75% of Turkish GDP is produced by 5 cities that Erdogan lost. The top 3 plus Adana and Antalya. And that was Siri interrupting us. It's unbelievable. Did you see what happened? Confirmed me that these are the top 5 cities in Turkey. This is unbelievable. Sorry about that. I thought that I turned it off. Digitalization is dangerous, as you see. So I think it's a great moment for democracy now. Not the program, but the world, because people have been seeing now that authoritarian leaders who swing their competitive authoritarian regimes to full authoritarianism, who work on that, can actually lose when 3 things happen, which are the reasons of his loss. The first is if the democratic forces do not buy into the polarization of the authoritarian leader, they win. If they have spent addressing Erdogan on the ground, they would be losing right now. Instead, they focused on their own agenda. They forgot Erdogan and just said, this is what we're going to do. This is why we have to come to power. Polarization off. Second, they didn't take social media very seriously. Social media works to polarize. You're a social democrat, social media wants you to be a Stalinist. You're right-wing, social media wants you to be a fascist. All right? So they stayed away from social media polarization. They built coalitions with other sectors of the society, including right-wing Democrats, plus the economic recession that was the product of Erdogan's mismanagement of the economy helped them too.
Well, I want to go to the economic conditions in Turkey, which are really striking. In August 2018, the value of the lira, the Turkish lira, plummeted, losing 28% of its value against the dollar. Inflation is at 20%. The federal minimum wage has fallen by about 10%, etc. So first, can you talk about what led to these conditions? Because he was in power for 16 years, but the economy began collapsing only recently. And how obviously he's known, you referred to him also as authoritarian. What were the principal features of his rule, 16 years?
Fantastic. The first question, what really triggered this economic recession? It's very difficult for people to invest in Turkey right now because they don't know what's going to happen. The rule of law collapsed. I was indicted for trying to change the government of Turkey.
When were you indicted?
I've been indicted 25 times. I got 2 jail times, total of 3 years, and then I have another court case. But I'm not alone. This is whoever you are, whoever is criticizing Erdogan right now is held accountable for either terrorism charges or libel against the president charges. I have 3 years now, and probably I'm going to get 2 more, but they're all deferred. This is how he's silencing dissent. This is what happens. When rule of law collapses, when judges begin to ask people that, do you really want to change the government? And when they say, yeah, this is democracy. My job as an opposition is to change government, right? I mean, when did this crime? They became so relaxed that they began to indict people for trying to change the government. Like Osman Kavala, who was right now indicted to change the government by terroristic means in organizing Gezi movement, which was ridiculous because it's a social movement of 71 cities in 73 cities of the Turkey, which is like 495% of the cities. Even Erdogan doesn't have such a coordination power, right? So the economic crisis happened when people begin to pull back from investments as a result of collapse of rule of law. What would be the consequence of it? Imagine when I was in your show, many times from Istanbul, my salary was around $2,000 as a university associate professor in the public sector. Now it is around $1,000. So this means recession for, middle-class people like us. Think about the working class, all right, who are not even dreaming of making...
This is $1,000
a month. A month, not week. Yes, you might have thought about it, but this is what happens. And people begin to buy potatoes one by one instead of kilogram, which is 2 times more than pound, as you know. So 1 potato, 1 onion. So what did Erdogan do? He said, look, people are trying to play with our economy, all right? And this is terrorism. Related to the United States of America and other foreign forces, it's always the foreign forces. And he put the blame on the eggplant terrorism, which kind of made it a little bit very difficult to understand the general people. When he says that, people who criticize me are terrorists,
what does that mean, eggplant terrorism?
That eggplant is so expensive now that they are trying to address Turkish polity with eggplants and increasing its price. But his son-in-law is running the economy.
Explain, though, he recently extended his term. So what does it mean in these regional elections to have him lose in his kind of hometown of Istanbul and Ankara, the significance of this? And will this mean that his term could decrease?
It may happen and it may not happen. He still won more people's votes, all right? But in this election, the grassroots activity made it possible for people to look at ballot boxes, because elections are determined not by voters, but vote counters. You don't have a problem during vote count, you may believe in democracy. So the other second very significant consequence of this election, Amy, is the following. It was an unlevel playing field, all right? Imagine the Super Bowl, and one team doesn't have helmets and paddings. And then they're trying to stop the other team. The team without the helmets and the paddings were Social Democrats, and they stopped AK Party's Islamist team with huge helmets, and referees were helping them, and they had paddings. So this is a great message to the world. Stay away from polarization of the autocratic leader. Believe in democracy. Believe in grassroots activity, not Twitter. All right? Work together. Carry your message, and then keep an eye on the ballot box. Things may change in the next general election. This is the local election, but this is how authoritarian parties feed their electorate, all right? They use local city sources to send cash support to their electorates. And losing Istanbul and Ankara is a big blow.
Erdogan said it himself, that whoever wins Istanbul wins Turkey.
Exactly.
And he was, of course, previously the mayor of Istanbul himself.
Exactly.
Now, could you talk about what has been happening in terms of the economic crisis in Turkey? Also, the relationship with the U.S., Turkey's relationship with the U.S., which has now taken a turn for the worse after Turkey has bought or is negotiating an arms deal with Russia.
Yes, S-40s, right? The arms deal is done, and the missiles seem to be coming to Turkey, and they didn't back down from it, which is a big blow to its NATO alliances. You don't want to buy guns from a dictator, all right? You want to strengthen your army, being loyal to your coalitions, all right? But it becomes very difficult for Turkey to be loyal to its coalitions because President Trump created a context where world leaders and citizens around the world do not understand what the United States is trying to do. So people do not trust in the United States and its leadership right now. On top of this, we had a bloody coup attempt organized in part by Fethullah Gülen, who lives in America right now. And a lot of people in Turkey know that he was behind it.
If you could just explain who he is.
He is a cleric, he's an imam, who used to, help people pray. And then he built an empire thanks to Erdogan's political power. And Erdogan's political power got authority thanks to the empire that Gülen made. This is like, think about this as an inter-problem between Trotskyites and Stalinists in previous
They were once
left.
close, Erdogan and Fethullah Gülen.
Yes. So they were very close. They were working together. And Gülen left Turkey for America and has been living here in a self-imposed exile.
In the Poconos.
In the Poconos, yes. And in a huge campus. And what really happened was that his followers in the army organized a factionalist coup and failed in Turkey because everyone was against them. Democrats, liberals, seculars, Islamists, and then they remained alone. So Erdogan wants him to be sent to Turkey for reasons that are legitimate, and United States government says no. So this also creates a problem. Everyone in Turkey wants him back, Islamist or secular, anti-Erdogan and Erdogan, because Erdogan is a part of the legitimate political world in Turkey. Secular people are not afraid of Erdogan, but they would be afraid of Gülen, who has never been a part of the political society, stayed away, tried to affect it with other sources like the military bureaucracy and the state power.
But when we last interviewed you, I mean, tens of thousands of Turkish people had been arrested by Erdogan,
Yes.
dissidents, teachers,
Yes.
professors,
Of
all
course.
sorts of people.
Of course.
Now, this issue of global geopolitics with Pence just this week, Vice President Pence, warning Turkey against going ahead with its planned purchase of the Russian-made S-400 missile system, hours after the Turkish foreign minister said the acquisition was a done deal. Pence saying this would be a threat to NATO. Just as we wrap up, where Turkey stands now, you're saying it's like many countries. They don't know how to deal with an extremely unpredictable U.S. president. But where it stands now in alliances in the world.
Amy, United States leadership is doing worst in trying to convince governments to work with itself. If Pence says everyone that Turkey has to learn a lesson or we're going to teach them a lesson, no one is going to take for it. And diplomacy is different than policies. S-40 is not even a part of American politics' radar right now. Why do you use this in order to alienate Erdogan? Just tell him what could be done and then move on. Instead, American leadership recognizes Jerusalem as the capital and tries to, say that, okay, Syrians' Golan Heights now can be Israeli property. And then everyone is looking at it. This is coffee house talk. This is not diplomacy and politics. So Pence made it very difficult for Erdogan to step back, but Erdogan is known to change his positions very rapidly if he thinks that he's a radical pragmatist. I mean, more than being an Islamist, and usually Islamists are very radical pragmatists in a way. And he can change his position because last time, when he tried to blackmail American government with a pastor, sending a pastor to jail and then home arrest, he lost it and he had to send it back because American sanctions led to a deepening of the recession and crumbling of the dollar, U.S. lira against dollar.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, but of course we'll continue to follow Turkish politics. Koray Çalışkan, faculty fellow now at the Heilbronner Center for Capitalism Studies at the New School here in New York. Recently came from Istanbul, Turkey. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, massive Algerian protests topple the president. Stay with us.
mapusu damlarına öğüt vereni bol olur. Toplasam o öğütleri buradan köye yol olur. Toplasam o öğütleri buradan köye yol olur. Ana baba bacı kardeşler günümde el olur. Ana baba bacı kardeşler günümde el olur. Namus belasına kardeş döktüğümüz kan bizim. Namus belasına kardeş döktüğümüz kan bizim. Hep bir hallı turhallıyız biz bize benzeriz. Hep bir hallı turhallıyız biz bize benzeriz. 100.000 kere tövbe eder gene şarap içeriz. 100.000 kere tövbe eder gene şarap içeriz. At bizim, avrat bizim, silah bizim, şan bizim. At bizim, avrat bizim, silah bizim, şan bizim. Namus belasına kardeş yatarız zindan bizim. Namus belasına kardeş yatarız zindan bizim. Kız gelinim suna boylum doyamadan biz bize. Kız gelinim suna boylum doyamadan biz bize. Besmeleyle yüzünü açıp oturmadan diz dize. Besmeleyle yüzünü açıp oturmadan diz dize.
The Curse of Honor by Jem Karaca. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We turn now to Algeria, where after 2 decades in power, longtime President Abdelaziz Bouteflika resigned on Tuesday following weeks of protest. The move came shortly after military leaders called for him to step down. The 82-year-old president has been in power for 20 years and has rarely been seen in public since suffering a stroke in 2013. Algerians have gathered in mass protests for weeks demanding his resignation, as well as an overhaul of the current political system. On Tuesday, Algeria's Army Chief of Staff demanded the president's removal. Within hours, Algerian state television broadcast images of Bouteflika handing his resignation letter to the Constitutional Council as an anchor read the news.
The President of the Republic, Mr. Abdelaziz Bouteflika, officially announces today the decision to end his role as President of the Republic to the Constitutional Council, effective today.
On Tuesday night, Algerians took to the streets of the capital, Algiers, to celebrate Bouteflika's departure.
I went out to celebrate the resignation of Bouteflika. We have removed the biggest pin. God willing, we will have a 100% democratic transition. This is very important. We need to remove the whole previous regime, and that is the hardest thing. It's hard to do it peacefully, but I have huge trust in the Algerian people to keep it peaceful, to move to a country of institutions, not gangs, and everything will be good, God willing.
Protests against President Bouteflika began in February after he announced he would not run for a 5th term. He then withdrew his candidacy under immense pressure, but postponed the upcoming elections, sparking fear he would seek to remain in power through 2019 or beyond. Now that he's resigned, student groups are calling for new protests Friday to demand an overhaul of Algeria's political system and an end to the ruling class, which has been in power for decades. For more, we're joined right now by Siham Melasliker, an Algerian-born activist who moved to the U.S. in 2010 after winning the visa lottery. She founded the group Stand By Me to promote Algerian and North African culture. She's in close touch with her family members and protest leaders in Algeria. Mela, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Talk about the significance of what has just taken place. Mass protests in the streets toss out the long-standing president.
The biggest thing I think about the protest was the resignation of the president was the first step, and not really what the protest started out to be, and even the goal of the protest. This has been going on for, this is about a party that has been in power since the independence in 1962 from the French colonization. This has been a party and a very close circle of people where, while Bouteflika is, the face of the government and his resignation is a good first step, it's far more beyond that. And I think that's what the Algerian people are fearing from the follow-up of his resignation. And most importantly, they don't want just him to resign, but revamp the entire government and the entire constitution to make sure that this never happens again.
Well, I want to go back to some of the thousands of protesters who gathered in central Algiers to pressure the president to resign.
We came out today to show that all the people in the 48 cities reject this regime. I say to the regime that we came out here peacefully and in a civilized, democratic way. 20 years is enough, so get out. Algeria has many candidates who are competent to take on the job. Why would you stifle them in their own country? Our youth deserve a better breath of fresh air. Algeria doesn't deserve this. We deserve to live in peace.
So that's a protester, one of the many thousands demanding Bouteflika's resignation. But you say that the protests weren't just about that or even principally about that. Can you explain?
Yeah, because so the president hasn't, as you mentioned, hasn't been seen since 2013 when he had his stroke, and the entire
when you
Algerian
say hasn't been seen, we're talking about 6 years.
No, it hasn't made any public appearance since 2013, before his election in 2014, and even and barely any. There's been kind of a loophole of pictures from the 90s and pictures from the early 2000s whenever they wanted to have, an appearance.
He's paralyzed, right?
He's paralyzed. He's been on a wheelchair, and
we've seen video of him in a wheelchair.
Videos of him in a wheelchair, but he hasn't been really conscious. He's been going back and forth to different countries, to Geneva and France, to make sure that, that he has a follow-up with his medical condition. And he hasn't really been in power. And I think the Algerian people really, we understand that. We know that the power is not really him. He might be the face because of his, he used to be popular in the 90s, early of his terms, and he had the will of the people, but right now he's just the face of a corrupt government, of something that's beyond him, and that's why the Algerian people are not about, it's not about the resignation, the protest is not about him really, it's about the circle of people under him.
Would you call what started in February a new Arab Spring? And is it true that protest is illegal in Algiers, in the capital?
Yes, so the protests are illegal in Algiers, and it has been. This is not the first protest.
Is protest illegal throughout Algeria?
No, just Algiers, the capital. But this new era of protest, the main thing that most people had shared with all on social media and everywhere with the organizers and the Algerian people was that the main thing, we need to be peaceful, not to be another Arab Spring, not to show any kind of pictures or any footage of people, destroying property or anything like that. The main thing was Salmiya, which means, peaceful throughout the entire protest everywhere. And it's not just in Algiers, but this has been a solidarity between throughout the entire country with, Algiers, Iran, multiple cities. Everyone has been out in the streets since the end of February. And the reason why I think is a little bit different than the Arab Spring is that it's not just, there's no end of just one person. They're trying to have an entire revamp of the constitution, an entire change of the power, but not just by having one person resign or even one party having to resign. It's a first step and the first kind of era for a much longer process that the people are asking for.
Well, elections are due to be held in 90 days. Now, many in Algeria have been talking about the black decade that followed the 1991 elections, which Islamist parties won, but the military canceled their victory, and then there were about several years, almost a decade, of civil war. So if you could talk about whether, and 200,000, almost 200,000 people died in that violence. So first of all, could you talk about whether people are concerned that the upcoming elections will not be fair or may result in a similar outcome, and what Bouteflika's role was during that civil war?
So this is exactly why the protests, the people are demanding for more than just the resignation of Bouteflika, because the main thing is that Bouteflika's popularity was at the highest because he came in after the decades, and during the civil war, there was the army canceled the election, and that's the biggest fear with with the people and these protests, which is why they want to have complete different kind of outcome, which is right now after the President Bouteflika resigns, Ben Salah, who is the President of the Senate, is going to take power for the next 90 days until there's a new election. Now, Ben Salah is he's Bouteflika's right hand. He has been in power around the same time as the FLN, and Bouteflika has been in power as well. And also, he's kind of seen as the one of the major players after Bouteflika's stroke. So the main thing is that, as I said, after Bouteflika's role after the civil war was he came out to unite the people. He changed the perception of international community about Algeria. He started a lot of good things, and the irony is that if he came out after the 2 terms and didn't change the constitution in 2009 to keep running as much as he wants, and most importantly to give more power to the president and the Senate, this wouldn't been the protest would have been completely different for the messaging. It would have been about the FLN party, would have been about a lot more than just one president, which is why the Algerian people are not stopping here. There's another protest that's organized for Friday, and even more every Friday until Ben Salah resigns. That's what the people want. They also want an entire, because they know that since it's not just one person, there's multiple for the entire party. They want to have, in the constitution it says that when the president resigns from the interim, the president of the Senate resigns from the interim presidency, there is a clause that mentions that the committee needs to vote in a new person by majority to kind of oversee the 90 days and make sure that there's a fair election and a democratic process. That's the first step that the protesters are asking for. Again, because of the system there's been so much corruption throughout the different parties and different people in power for those since the 60s. Most importantly, it's older people. These protests, as you can see, are mainly organized on social media by younger generations. Algeria itself is, 70% of the population is under 35. So it's, even though the first step to ask for, the rest of the Senate to decide for a new president to oversee the new election in 90 days, it's far more than that. It's the first step to have an entire change.
Well, you said that the protests, the younger generation, 75% of the population is below the age of 35. Mm-hmm. What are the demographics of the protesters? Where are they from? What kind of work do they do? Are they principally students? How did they come together? Social media, you said? Yes.
So this is the beauty of this protest, and this is why it's been so successful, is that they're giving, an example of civic engagement, of really peaceful protest, and showing what the power of the people is. And because it might have started out with younger generations and on social media and everything, but it kind of now became an overall protest for all of the different generations, because the younger generations do not remember the 60s, do not remember mostly the civil war in the 90s, and don't have this admiration for the party and for Bouteflika himself. But also the older generation now is in solidarity with the younger generation, not because they forgot what happened or that the FLN party got them to the independence from the French, but mainly because they see that people 80 years old and over do not have the same idea as younger people. Like they want different economy, they have different ideologies, they want more freedom and technology and more than that. And mostly there are doctors, there are farmers. It transplants the entire protest is from different people. And the good thing about that is that you can see that there's been a lot of immigration throughout the years to France, and there was a lot of people who were trying to travel through the seas. There was a lot of deaths, and the amazing thing is that since the start of the protest, there has been no attempt to escape from Algeria, which shows that it's beyond just the one person. It's beyond just these protests. It's kind of like trying to start a whole new life for Algeria and for Algerians.
Well, Siham Al-Silkar, we want to thank you very much for being with us. Algerian-born activist who moved to the United States in 2010, founded the group Stand By Me to promote Algerian and North African culture, in close touch with family members back home in Algeria, as well as protest leaders. Currently an advisor to New York State Senator Andrew Gennardis, and serves on the board of NIPAN, or the New York Progressive Action Network. When we come back, yellow vest protesters take to the streets for the 20th straight week in France. Stay with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
ولادك راهم خارجين يمشيوا على الحرية يما ولادك متحضرين طالبين ديمقراطية كل ورد زيد الياسمين في مسيرة سلمية عالتغيير معولين اليوم الشعبي ليبرالي 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 اليوم الشعبي الشعب يلعب 10 والسيستم ما فهموش كوتسيزو يجيبها برا ويماركي ما تحقروش 10 سنين تدمر 10 والو مازال ما شبعتوش وبربي هذا المرة والو ناضي ما تفوتوش
Free Algeria, the song was recorded by Algerian artists in solidarity with demonstrations demanding an overhaul of the current political system, has become a protest anthem. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We end today's show in France, where Yellow Vest protesters took to the streets Saturday for the 20th straight week of anti-government demonstrations, in spite of the French authorities' clampdown on the movement. Last month, the French government deployed military forces and banned protesters from marching on the Champs-Élysées and other areas after clashes with the police, nearly 200 arrests, and damage to businesses by some protesters. Police used tear gas and water cannons on crowds in Paris. Activists, who are now fewer in number, ended their march in Paris on the Place du Trocadéro. This is Yellow Vest organizer Sophie Tissier.
No, the movement is not losing power. We are simply getting organized. Indeed, we are facing a government crushing us in the media, and we do not have the same media strength as the government to highlight our ideas. They are discrediting us. They are lying about us. French Interior Minister Castaner is lying when he says we do not have any demand. He is a liar, and I think it is unacceptable in a democracy that a government can be as deceiving and can bear such irresponsible words. The government keeps on lighting fires. Do they want a round of protests similar to March 16th? Is that what they want? Do they want people to turn to violence and insurgency because of their scorn?
More than 33,000 demonstrators nationwide joined the protest Saturday, down from nearly 300,000 in November, according to government estimates. The weekly protests began last year when France announced plans to hike gas taxes, with demonstrators across France taking to the streets to protest French President Emmanuel Macron's government. The demonstrators gained their name by wearing the yellow safety vests that French drivers are required to keep in their cars in case of emergency. Since then, in protests that have now lasted 5 months, the yellow vests have called out Macron's pro-business economic policies, demanding fair wages for working and middle-class people and heavier taxation on the wealthy. We're going to Paris right now, where we're joined by journalist Alexis Poulain. He is co-founder of the news website Le Monde Moderne. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Alexis. So when this first started happening at the end of last year, and they were protesting the gas tax, in world media, they were sort of being described as anti-environmentalist. But if you can explain the fundamental protest movement that this has become and the challenge to the French leadership.
Well, yeah, as you said, it started with the tax gas and people, the middle class saying enough is enough. Always the same people are paying the taxes. And it was starting with a lie, because the government said that the tax was to fund ecological reforms, which was not the case. It was just to put some more money into the government budget. And within the 5 months that have passed, the small protests on roundabouts become a regime crisis and a sort of another one of these peak of revolution, like we had Nuit Debout, you had Occupy Wall Street, for example. And now the people are marching for Macron to stop his pro-business neoliberal policies in France, and they demand tax justice, social justice, and some clear, fair state services for all, which is very different from the beginning. What's amazing is that it is still on 5 months down and going on to the 6 months, and despite the violence of the police and the government trying to stop the movement.
Well, Alexei, France, has a long and robust history of protests and demonstrations against the government. But many commentators say that the Yellow Vest movement, has no precedent in French history. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, often when you refer to France, there is the revolution in '89 and May 68 in 1968. Yellow Vest is very different in a sense that it's been going on for 5 months. And there have been different weekends, but every act, because it's an act every Saturday, there is a different color to it. It's yellow, of course, but it can be violent or not. But what is clearly different from the past is that we have people marching from very different background. And they demand now to be heard. Their claims are for more democracy, more tax justice, and a future for their kids. A lot of these people in the streets are in retirement age, and they are still there saying, I think my grandson or grandchildren won't have a better future than what I lived. And this defense of the French welfare state has to be taken into account. And what's different from the past, from May 68 or other manifestation we had, is that the unions are far behind the popular movement of the Yellow Vest. They are not clearly supporting it, and they're trying to distance themselves from the Yellow Vest protests.
And Alexei, could you talk about the state response to these protests? You alluded earlier to the violence that has been inflicted on the protesters, but also the fact that the French state, following the protests and some of the damage that was done last month around the Champs-Élysées, that they've deployed the Operation Sentinel forces. Can you explain what that operation was and the significance of these armed soldiers with automatic weapons patrolling the streets of Paris?
Yeah, we have in France, since the terror attacks back in 2016, Sentinel operation. There are people from the army patrolling the streets and public buildings to prevent any terror attacks. During the past Yellow Vest march, they were there and they are protecting public monuments. They are not supposed to be confronting the protester. And what wasn't clear is when the government said that they will require more army forces for Sentinel for the Act 20th. There was a lot of question about why are you requiring the army? This is not a democracy that should do that. And there have been some clarification from the Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Defense, saying that the Sentinel forces will be, as ever, only looking after the monuments and the buildings and the public places, but certainly not confronting the protester. But what it says about this government is that it's escalating in violence and trying to deter people to go marching in the streets. There have been over 2,000 people who have been injured by LBD, this flashball weapon, and people have lost limbs. And all this without any coverage by the French media for 2 months. And it took one journalist, David Dufresne, who actually monitored all this police violence so that eventually we managed to talk about government violence.
Alexei, many have commented on the lack of racial diversity of the protests. Immigrants, minorities suffering the disproportionate rates of unemployment and poverty, yet they are not leading these protests. Talk about who's being represented here.
Yes, I mean, at the beginning, on the roundabouts, there were more diversity, women and people from communities. Right now, you could say that the people who are marching every weekend are more the sort of small-town France or the peripheric France, the people that are on the fringe. They are the invisible people for the elite, the people who govern. It's written in Julie books, for example. There is something similar to what you have in the US, where you have the cities against rural country. And it's the Trump America in some extent, but also with protesters coming from the left wings. All political colors are there. But clearly, it's the people who are left behind globalization and who can see what is the deal for them in this march towards a global market.
And the comments that if these were black French people who are protesting, there would be many more injuries, that they would be attacked or could be killed. And also, what about the charges of racism and anti-Semitism?
Yes, I mean, the government have tried everything to stop the movement. Police violence, we talk about it, but the other thing was also to pretend the movement was anti-Semitic, racist, to prevent people joining the movement. It's not as more racist or anti-Semitic as the rest of French society. Of course, you have some people with these beliefs, but they are certainly not the vast majority of people in the Yellow Vest movement. And the key issue about police violence is clearly, as you state, mainly going on for years in French suburbs, and it's untalked about. And this is now where these people that are mostly white people from rural regions are experiencing what is the violence of the state in France.
Well, Alexis, could you also talk about the way in which Macron has responded to the protests? I mean, he's disliked intensely, not just for his neoliberal policies, but for the outright contempt that he's demonstrated towards the poor in France, telling, for instance, a labor activist who he was in a dispute with while he was economic minister, who pointed out, the labor activist pointed out that that Macron's suit was worth 1,600 euros. And Macron responded by saying, well, the best way to afford a suit is to work. And there are several examples of comments like this that Macron has made.
Yeah, Emmanuel Macron is very famous for his little comments. And the way he responded to the movement was with contempt, as you said. The first 2 months, he was in denial. He didn't want even to talk or mention the movement. It was just as if it didn't exist. After that, he tried to give out some money and make some measures to answer the claims of the protesters. And what we see after that, it didn't work to stop the movement, so came in the violence of the police forces. And now what we have is Emmanuel Macron touring France with the big debate, as he called it, supposed to have French people talking to each other and finding solution to get out of this crisis. But the big debate has been so far a one-man show, a stand-up for Emmanuel Macron, talking to mayors, talking to people, talking to kids, talking to retired people, and just exposing his policy, because we're coming into a phase where European elections are coming, and this is a stage campaign for his party En Marche. So the answer has been clearly a war towards the Yellow Vest rather than a dialogue. And what we have now is two camps that are certainly not talking to each other and don't want to stop this fight going on.
And finally, where do you see the Yellow Vest protests going? 300,000 months ago, now around 30,000. What's going to happen next?
Well, that's the big question mark. Is it because May is coming, the spring is coming, so people could come back to the roundabouts and having more meetups and start again the movement with more power. Right now, clearly, there are less and less people in the streets because of the violence, because of the weather, because of the time. It's been 6 months. But it could be that because of the conclusion of the big debate, there could be a national disappointment about what the measure will be announced by Emmanuel Macron, and then we'll start again a bigger protest. Whatever happens is that people might stop or take out their yellow vest. The anger in the French society is still there, and it will be going on for a few years without political solution.
Alexis Poulain, we want to thank you very much for being with us. Journalist based in Paris, co-founder of the news website Le Monde Moderne. That does it for our show. If you'd like to sign up for our daily digest, our news headlines, you can go to democracynow.org. You can text the word Democracy Now! To 66866. I'm Amy Goodman with Noreen Sheikh.